to begin the recording?
Yep, that's what I thought.
Okay, excellent. So thank you, Antoinette. And I am going to be hopping off, but if there are any questions, feel free to call me, message me. I am available. Thank you.
All righty, good to see you, Jen. Happy Thanksgiving. Okay, so I am going to try to manage the participants if anybody else logs in late and the chat. So forgive me if I am in a delay because it's going to be a small group. I encourage you to unmute if you have a question because it's going to be hard for me to kind of present and also watch the chat. So by all means, if you have a question, unmute, or you can do the raise your hand icon on Zoom, so you can raise your hand. I do have the videos popped up. I always love active participation. So if you have any feedback or input, this is the second part of a 2-session group for business email compromise. So if you didn't get a chance to watch the first one, that's okay. We're going to do a little bit of a review, but by all means, go back and take a look at the first one. It's pretty informative. And with that, I think all 3 of you have attended sessions before, so I won't get too detailed into my history. You all know who I am. I'm a local in the Hudson Valley, live in Bloomingburg. I am a trustee member for the Mamakating Library as well. So I am still the same person with the same people in my family and all that fun stuff. So if you haven't seen my introduction, go back to one of the other sessions. I think this is the 8th time at this point. But I do have some exciting news. I just recently published a book. It is called The Digital Citizen's Guide to Cybersecurity. It is available on Amazon. I'm actually going to be donating a few copies to the Mamakating Library to see if they'll put it into circulation. So if anybody's interested, please shoot me a message or an email, and I'd be more than happy to drop a few copies off. Even though I'm a trustee, I didn't know what the process was of getting a library book into circulation, and we had an event recently and our librarian was like, just bring them in. I'm like, oh. So if anybody's interested, I'd be more than happy to drop a few copies off, but it is really a non-technical guide that follows some of the similar trainings that we've done here to try to make cybersecurity and cyber hygiene accessible to people of all ages. Target audience for this book is age 12 to 100. So it's really anybody that has engaged on the internet or with social media or any kind of online platform. So thank you very much, Claudia. So several people have already posted in the chat what their role is in the library. There's only 6 of you. So Claudia, I see that you're with Havistraw. If you could just post your role, and then also Megan and Ref, I guess, is someone else is joining in. If you could just post your role at the library that you are with, that would be fantastic. It just helps me to learn a little bit about the audience and kind of who I'm speaking to. So it's a short agenda today, so I won't keep you probably for the full hour, but it's going to be jam-packed with great tips and tricks. So you joined on a really great day. So the first thing we're going to do is review what a business email compromise is and kind of how that happens. And then I have 10 business email compromise protection tips that we're going to go over so that it could be actionable things that you can do in your daily life and also convey back to your staff and anybody else who's within your library system. So just as a review, a business email compromise is also referred to as an email account compromise. And it's a scam where criminals send an email message which appears to come from a known source, making it look legitimate. And they are typically financially focused, but they can be focused with other goals, right? But typically it's financially focused, trying to get someone to create a financial transaction that they would otherwise think is normal. So some of the common business email scams that are out there are CEO fraud, where a particular criminal will pose to be a CEO of a an organization and then send out emails asking employees to do specific things, usually around buying and shipping gift cards or making wire transfers to different accounts. And usually they'll send the email as if it's coming from, an executive from an organization. Account compromise, that's when credentials are stolen and the bad actor actually gets into it in a legitimate account. So they're not spoofing an account. We'll get into that in a minute. They're not spoofing an account. It actually is an email that comes from the legitimate email sender, but because the account credentials were compromised, it's the bad actor posing to be that person. False invoice scheme. This is where this often happens with companies that use browser-based services like QuickBooks, for example, where you can send an invoice with a link or QR code to send a wire transfer or pay a bill. And that link or QR code actually leads you to a wrong account, right? Account that doesn't belong to the actual vendor. Attorney impersonation. This happens a lot in real estate. So if you engage in any kind of real estate transactions, be wary of this type of scam. It happens very, very often where either the real estate agent or the buyer or seller gets information or emails sent from what appears to be one of the attorneys and usually has them sending money to an account that obviously is not the correct account. And then of course, data theft, where business email compromises are used to penetrate networks and then exfiltrate sensitive data. So I went over this actually in the last session, but I thought it was important enough to go over it again because it's one of the things that we need to recognize is that the social engineering that goes on behind the scenes before the attack even happens is pretty sophisticated, but it's also not something that takes a lot of sophisticated tools, but it just takes time. So typically the target is identified, whether it's going to be an organization or an individual, by the criminal, and they then will start the grooming process. So the grooming process and the identification of the target usually involves scouring the internet for publicly available information. And a really good source for that, we talked about last session, was LinkedIn in organizations. So LinkedIn is the one place where you can go and find a company and then
this
business within their company. They, I think that was muted. It should have been muted. Okay. So within the organization, you'll be able to see the org chart where you know who the employees are and also who the executives are. And then from there, you can actually go and see who reports to who because everybody's putting it on their LinkedIn account, right? So a really good place for a cyber criminal to start would be go to LinkedIn, look for the individuals, and then look for who's associated with which organization. Also, typically within LinkedIn, people will have their business emails as part of their contact information. So if you have a public profile, I can go to your profile and click on the button that says contact information. And now I know exactly what your email address is. So I'm already, 60 or 70% there just by going to LinkedIn to determine how I can perform these types of scams against an organization. Once the criminal identifies the target and identifies the email account that they would like to compromise, they will either do one of two things. They will either go to the dark web and look for that email address that may have already had compromised credentials and try to what we call brute force attack the email account, which means that they will go to Office 365 and try to use that email address and compromised password to get into the account, or they will create an account under a different domain that looks similar, and then it appears to be the same person, or they will just take a completely different email account and spoof it. So in the from box at the top, it'll appear to be from that email address, but if you looked at the actual information behind it, it's a completely different account, like a Yahoo or something like that. So those are some ways in which they then try to target individuals within the organization. And then once they get that email account set up, they send out the email to It could be one individual, or it could be multiple individuals within an organization, or multiple individuals just within their contact list. They're hoping that somebody will fall for it. And if someone does, the victim will start exchanging information with the criminal, and then ultimately unwittingly will either make the wire transfer or send a credit card payment or buy the gift cards that they're asking. A lot of times, for some reason, they want people to do it in gift cards because it's less traceable. So does anybody have any questions about this? Oops, sorry, there's somebody in the waiting room. Does anybody have any questions about the stages of the attack, or the way in which social engineering is utilized to go after particular targets? Okay. So the next part of this training is actionable things. I have 10 tips that we can do to help protect ourselves and our organization against business email compromise. And so here, there are 4 things that we need to consider when we're looking at emails. The first one is called domain spoofing. So domain name spoofing involves the sender's mail from has to match the recipient's domain to the message envelope, or using a legitimate domain in the mail from value, which is using a spoofed reply to domain in the header. So if we look at this one here, you guys can see my my cursor on the, okay. So if we look at this one in the top right here, they are spoofing the domain name, right? So they've created this account and it appears to be from support@HSBC, right? So that would be a domain name spoofing. The next one is display name spoofing. And this is where most business email compromises will use this technique, where they're name spoofing. So here it appears to be HSBC, and I'm sorry that it's small. I was trying to get them all on the same page, and it was kind of difficult. So here it appears to be HSBC, but if you just look at the sender address, and the way you would do that is you'd click the down arrow, right, in the header, in the message header, and it'll show you clearly this is not an HSBC account, right? But if you're looking at it on a cell phone, it's very easy to think that this is coming from that legitimate account because it's small and you know, it's hard to see the message header. So this would be the display name spoofing. The next one is a lookalike domain spoof. So in a lookalike domain spoof, and I'll show you some examples in a future slide, but in a lookalike domain spoof, it takes HSBC, for example, and instead of being hsbc.com, maybe they'll do hsbc.net or hsbc.io or hsbc.org, or they may change one of the letters, or they may do hs-bc.com. So they're going to take the domain, they're going to make it look very, very similar, but it's not the actual domain, but it looks like it is. And then the last one we talked about earlier is the actual compromised email account, where I am getting the credentials for a legitimate account and then logging into their Office 365, going through their contacts list and sending out emails on that person's behalf. That's the least likely one. It happens, don't get me wrong, it definitely happens. I've actually had a colleague of mine that this happened to, but the easiest way for the bad actors to do this is the domain name spoofing and the display name spoofing, or the lookalike domain. It just takes a lot less work. The spoofing is a lot easier than actually gaining access to email accounts. However, remember, if we are using the same username and password for multiple types of accounts, and that credential combination gets compromised and is on the dark web, then we have to consider that bad actors typically know that we all use very similar accounts like Office 365 or Google, and they're going to try to use those credentials to get into your account. So again, it's another reason why we want to use multi-factor authentication, which is one of those tips and tricks, and also not reuse passwords, which is also on my tips and tricks list. But I can't say it enough, right? We want to make sure that we are not reusing account credentials. So the next step is think before you click. If you get an email, even if it looks legitimate from somebody and there's an attachment or there's a link that they're asking you to actively do something, and in the body of the email, they're telling you, making it as if it's a sense of urgency, right? You need to do this right away. It has to be done because I'm going to get in trouble if this isn't done. You need to do it. I forgot to do it, whatever it is. There's always going to be a degree of sense of urgency to make you feel rushed into making a decision. So this is really important. If you see an attachment on a document that has a weird name, or if there's a link, even if it's a hyperlink to a word or an image, just don't click on it, but hover over the link to look and see where that URL is. The URL will be very telling. You'll know right away if that's a legitimate link or something that's sending you somewhere that you shouldn't be going. So of course, my next tip here is think before you click. This is the domain spoofing. I wanted to show you some examples of what that looks like. So www.credocyber.com is my website. And if someone would want to spoof my email or my website or make it appear like it's the same domain, they may do something like this. They may take the E and turn it into a 3. They may take Credo Cyber and just add a different extension onto it. And it's very easy to do this. So a way that you can protect your organization is take your domain and variations of that domain and register them. And usually it'll be $3 or $4 a year or whatever it is. Register the domains that look similar to your domains so that somebody can't then go and create a website under your organization's name. That happens a lot. It's called a honeypot, where they will create like a credocyber.us and people will look at it and think it's my website and then have malware or other things on that website.
Antoinette, can I ask a question about that?
Yeah, of course.
Hi, so we changed over our website at the beginning of this year. It had been, like our dumb initials, like hkdpl.org. Nobody knows what that is. So changed it to haverstrawlibrary.org. And then maybe like 6 months later or so, I was like, oh, I wonder what, I hadn't updated a bookmark or something. And I clicked on it. It brought me to that, which has now been taken over by some, I don't know, look, maybe like a gambling site, but it wasn't in characters in a language that I can read. So I was kind of like, okay, well, I mean, I don't know what it's doing, but, it's not associated with us anymore. So I was kind of like, I'm not going to get too upset about it. But I guess I'm just sharing that. I guess I don't know.
So thank you for, okay, so that's actually really, really important fit stuff here, because that website was associated with your library and you had an old bookmark that had, since the URL has completely changed from what it was, by releasing that URL, right? When your library, whoever made the decision to change the URL over, you released the old URL, somebody else was able to take it. Well, if that is in fact a gambling site, or if it might be a site where there's malware or some sort of other thing, and somebody that formerly knew your website is now on there, that could have reputational damage to your library. So actually, something you may want to do is make a kind of like a press release or a public notice to say, this is our new website. Please do not use the old website, because if it is something that could potentially cause harm to someone else's computer, that could be a liability. So that's a really, really good point. If you do switch domains and you were using that in the past, it's probably better off to keep the domain name, right? And just so it doesn't get used again for whatever. But that's really interesting.
That kind of was our plan. And I think, I don't know, we dropped the ball, or our consultant dropped the ball. I'm not really sure. I thought we were going to keep the old website up with just a redirect for a year or two, but that sort of didn't happen. And then it was kind of already too late, but
no, and that's a really good point. And it's something that absolutely should be discussed. But since it did happen, putting something publicly, like announcing this is our new website, do not use the old URL, because that could be an issue. But really, really great point.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem. Oh, how can you protect, I'm sorry, how can you protect yourself from compromised email account? So by putting these things in place, it'll protect you from getting to the point where your account is compromised. If your account has already been compromised, the first thing I would do is change the username and password. Because you want to make sure that if that was the way that the person got in, that they can't get into your account. So if your account has actually been compromised and taken over, the first thing I would do is change the username and password, or if you can't change the username because it's usually the email address, change the password and implement multi-factor authentication, which is my next tip. So we'll get into that in a minute. If someone is spoofing, so spoofing happens more often, there's really nothing that you could do to necessarily protect yourself. But what you can do is if you're getting people that are contacting you to say, hey, did you send this email? It seems strange, you know, it's out of character or whatever. And you find out that somebody is in fact spoofing your contact information. I would, you know, try to notify your contacts to say, if you receive an email that is out of, you know, whatever, out of context, out of character, or asking you to do something, please don't respond because my account's being spoofed. It happens a lot. I actually used to be a chairperson for a local association chapter for the Hudson Valley. And we have these, we didn't give name specific email accounts to the chair and the vice chair because that rotates every couple of years. So the accounts are chair@asishudsonvalley.com or .org and vice chair @ and then there's one for our treasurer and there's one for our secretary, and it's treasurer @ and secretary @. Well, somebody took the chair email account and they spoofed it with some other, it was something else behind it, but they used the chair and then they sent it out to the entire chapter, saying, basically indicating that the same email that, oh, we need your help. Could you buy some gift cards? We're going to blah, 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 whatever it was. So we can't prevent that from happening. But when we became aware of it, we immediately sent out a notification to all our chapter members, letting them know that the account was being spoofed and not to comply. So I'm hoping that these 10 tips will help you build some layers of protection around your accounts. But if somebody is doing it actively, that means that these haven't worked. And then obviously you just have to take the steps to prevent them from doing it further, right? Like if they're in your account, change the password. The don't overshare on social media is really challenging, especially on LinkedIn, because oftentimes people will put, like, that's the whole purpose of LinkedIn, is to go and put your business information on LinkedIn. So, but try not to overshare more than you have to, especially with titles and responsibilities, the corporate structure information. Unfortunately, LinkedIn is now the mecca for all business email compromise, but oversharing on social media creates an abundance of opportunity for the bad actors. And it's not just LinkedIn, by the way, it's Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all of those. So my next point is using multi-factor authentication whenever possible. So multi-factor authentication, also known as 2FA or two-factor authentication. So typically you have a username and a password. Your username 99% of the time is an email account, which is so frustrating because everybody's email information is public. So that means that the bad actors already have 50% of the credential in their possession, right? To their knowledge. So with multi-factor authentication, it's the username, the password, and then one or more of these other things, something that you have in your possession, something that you know, or something that you are. Also known as something you have, something you are, and something you know. So in your possession could be like a text message that comes to your phone. Your phone is in your possession. It could also be a token. Tokens are in your possession. Knowledge would be a secret question. So, if you have it might have a username, a password, and then it could ask you, what was the name of the first car that you drove, or what was the name of the street you grew up on? Both of those things are not super secure because they can be intercepted and they can be reused. They could be basically glommed by the bad actors and then reused. The something you are is the most secure. So if you have something that can use some sort of biometric identifier, like the iPhones have the facial recognition, or a lot of the Android devices use fingerprint recognition, that biometric really truly verifies that you are the person that you say you are. So that factor is the most secure factor. But if you don't have that, there are authentication apps. That's something in your possession. The authentication apps are far more secure than a plain text message that gives you a code, or a plain text email that gives you a code. So Google has them, Apple has them, a lot of the different password managers have them. The authentication app gives you a one-time code, and it recycles every 20 or 30 seconds. So it can't be intercepted or reused. The next tip is to use strong passwords. So strong passwords do not mean you take a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and add an exclamation point at the end of it. It also doesn't mean that you take the same password that you use everywhere and just change one character on it, right? Because typically people already know that we're going to exchange S's for $signs and 3's for E's, right? So we want to make sure that we are using passwords that are not what we call brute force attackable. We want to ask to have a minimum length requirement. So not just 3 or 4 characters. The longer, I like the use of passphrases actually. The longer the password, take the complexity out of the mix where you're using the combination of characters, numbers, exclamation points, and special characters and things like that. The length of the password is going to trump the complexity of the password. So if you use a passphrase, for example, maybe a lyric of your favorite song, or, a sentence that's, a silly tongue twister or something like that, that is going to trump the complexity, and it's also going to be easier for you to remember. So make sure that when you're creating passwords that you are using complex, long passwords. My biggest recommendation is don't try to remember them all, because then you're going to end up writing them down somewhere or putting them in your phone somewhere. And then that's, becomes vulnerable. My biggest recommendation on passwords is to use a password manager. Password One, LastPass, Let Me In. These are all very inexpensive tools that can be used. They will store your passwords encrypted. So even if somebody were to steal the database, they wouldn't be able to know the passwords because they're encrypted. You use one master passphrase for your account. It will create a unique password for every one of your accounts. So using a password manager, in my opinion, would be one of the safest ways to store and manage your passwords. Then adding that second layer of multi-factor authentication, and it's going to mitigate a lot of the risk that you face when it comes to compromised credentials. How do you protect yourself in case where someone else's account has been compromised? So if you're the recipient of a compromised email, is that what you're saying? Okay. So that's when, if you remember, and I'll go back to the beginning, if you're receiving emails that the body of the email seems a little bit suspicious, that's where you want to check to make sure that or they're asking you to do financial transactions or something like that. You want to check to see, did this really come from the person that it came from, right? In the case where the account was actually hacked, where they're in a legitimate, so it's really coming from a legitimate Outlook account, that's challenging. So usually what will happen is they're going to send it from that account, but they're going to ask you to make a financial transaction that's probably not normal. It's probably going to have you do something like, can you wire this money, or can you do the gift cards? And it's going to be super out of character. That happened very recently to me, actually, but through text message. I got a text message that appeared to be coming from one of my colleagues, his actual phone number. But they spoofed the number through an SMS text message. And he asked me to buy gift cards. And it was really unusual for him, but I really genuinely thought it came from him. So I called him directly, and he was like, no, I didn't ask you to do that. And I sent him a screenshot to his actual phone number. And when I went in and looked at the details of the message, I realized it wasn't from that account. So it is difficult because they're becoming more and more sophisticated, but just be mindful that if somebody's asking you to do a financial transaction that's out of the norm, I would double check with it. My colleague that had a recent business email compromise where his Outlook account got compromised, they actually went through his inbox and outbox and found out all the people that he sent QuickBooks invoices to. They then recreated the invoice and took the QR code and the link behind it, and they made it go to a different bank account. But on the surface, it looked exactly what it was supposed to be. When someone clicked on it, though, the URL in the top of the screen was a different bank. And that's actually how they found out that they were doing it, because one of the recipients happened to notice that it was a different bank account. And so before he made the transfer, he made a phone call, and thankfully they ended up saving the money. So you just have to be super, super mindful about emails that are coming in that are asking you to do financial transactions. Does that help? Okay. The next thing, which I don't know if everyone on this call actually has access to or has any type of input into, but another way to make sure that your accounts are protected is to make sure devices and software are up to date. So that includes your own personal cell phone. If you're doing any kind of email on a personal cell phone, make sure that you run the updates periodically, because typically the updates will have patches for any kind of security vulnerabilities within your device. And then also, if you're using personal email and business email on the same phone, there's this possibility that one account could actually compromise the other account, right? So you want to make sure that your devices and your software are up to date. And I call this lifecycle management. So in any business environment, when you have technology, you go through these phases, right? So the first phase is procurement. The second phase is staging. The third phase is maintenance. The fourth phase is support. And the fifth phase is disposal. Each one of these stages or phases in the life cycle actually have very important implications as to how you protect your network and also your email, right? So as you're procuring technology, you want to make sure that your vendors are implementing security controls on their end so that your information is protected, which at whatever information you're providing to that vendor is protected. If you are procuring software or technology, you want to ask questions about patches, like if they have patch management or if they have a patch lifecycle, how often do they release patches? And then you want to determine who's responsible for doing those patches. So are you procuring technology from RCLS? And if so, does RCLS provide you with input as to when those things get updated and how they update it? Because one of the ways in which these compromises will happen is you'll get, again, remember social engineering, you will get a phone call to say, oh, we need to do an update on your computer. Please let me know what email address you want us to send the link to. They send you a link and then you click on it because you think that you're talking to tech support when in fact it's not tech support, and now they're into your system and your email account, right? So know what the process of maintenance is and support. And then when your technology is coming to the end of its life cycle, where it's no longer going to be supported by the manufacturer of the software or hardware, you need a process to dispose of that as well. We can't just take a computer and give it away, right? We want to make sure that we wipe the hard drives clean, that we're disposing of the data, the hard drives properly, right? So that data destruction piece and the technology destruction piece is important, because if you have an outdated device that has information about the library that you're working for, the accounts, that could be utilized against the organization as well. This is really important. Making sure that you establish a strict process for financial transactions. Every library is different. At the Mamakating Library, we're very small. And so there's only 3 or 4 people that are engaged in the bill payment process or financial transaction process within our library. Obviously, the trustees oversee that, but typically there's a couple of people that have access to this information. So and the ability to access accounts. So having a strict process for these types of financial transactions, so that if an email comes through asking somebody to create a wire transfer, for example, to a vendor, or receives an invoice, there's a system of checks and balances before that person will just click on it and then go and send money over. So making sure that there's a process, whether you have a threshold, a financial threshold, where if it's over a certain amount of money, that there has to be a second person reviewing the transaction, or if if it's coming from a news source or something like that, you'd have to have two people authorize the financial transaction. Or in general, if it's a wire transfer request, wires cannot be completed without verification or authorization by a secondary person. If you have these types of policies and procedures in place, it will prevent somebody from reading an email. Remember, I said before, usually there's a real strong sense of urgency to do the transaction. So it'll prevent somebody from reading the email, going into some sort of panic mode, and just performing the transaction. So having that process in place is really helpful. Are there any questions about that? Okay. The next step is making sure that you're running antivirus software regularly on all of the devices. So we often think about our computers that we're working on, our laptops that we're working on, but if you're working from iPads, if you're working from cell phones, having antivirus software on those devices as well is really important. A lot of times the mobile devices we forget about. So if your device is connected to the internet, no matter what it is, you should have antivirus software on that device. A lot of the manufacturers for software have licensing so that you can put multiple devices on one license. So I use a company called Bitdefender. Bitdefender allows me to protect 5 or 6 different devices. So I have a laptop, I have a PC tower, I have a cell phone, and I have an iPad, all covered under that one license, right? So making sure that you have antivirus on all your devices, have the antivirus being run regularly, and making sure that the software is up to date. Like I said, that software also has to be part of the lifecycle management process of your organization. And then, of course, the last and most important thing is training. Taking these trainings are very, very important because it helps you to become aware of the dangers that are out there. The threat landscape changes every single day. There's all new risks and threats. Every day there's new types of ransomware, there's new types of attack vectors. And so just being aware that this stuff is happening is really important. But then taking this information and bringing it back to your libraries and socializing it within your organization as well is very important. So making sure that you're not only attending these trainings as an individual, but that you are having periodic trainings with your staff members at your library, at least on a quarterly basis, but at best, on a monthly basis, to make sure that people are remembering this security culture and the security mindset. I mentioned in the very beginning when we first started doing this entire series that, being in a library setting or even in a school setting is challenging when it comes to any kind of security, because it's an open, welcoming mindset. You want people to come in, you want them to feel like they're part of everything. At the same time, it is your responsibility to protect them and to protect your staff. So there's this real strong balance that has to occur between security and that openness, but you can strike that balance. And that really has to do with culture, right? So it's creating this culture of security, allowing people to understand that security is essential in order to be able to provide services and be open and be available to the community. And then having the community members recognize what their responsibilities are in terms of the security of your environment and your the other patrons and your employees. So that's what I have. Oh, do you need a third-party antivirus software and Apple devices as well? So I use a third party because I have it available, but Apple devices do have various different settings on them for like firewall, VPNs, and things like that. So as long as you are implementing those things, you should be good. I just always like to have a third party because for me, I just feel like there's a dashboard, so I have a little bit of more control. But yeah, Apple devices definitely have a lot of built-in security features already. The VPN is actually one that should be used if you don't have a third-party VPN as well. So this is my contact information. I know this wasn't as long as our other sessions, but I really wanted to provide some actionable things that everybody could do to kind of put into their daily lives that didn't seem overwhelming or didn't seem like something that was going to cost a lot of money. And also things that you could take back to your organization and pretty easily put into part of everyday policy, procedure, and process. So I'm going to open it up. It is a small group. Mary, I know you came, and Anya, I know you came a little bit late. So if you'd like me to go over anything, please let me know. I'm going to stop the recording.